Imagine you walk into a room, the door shuts behind you, and it won't open again for 5 years. You go in as one person. You come out as something else. Not broken, not fixed, just fundamentally different. The question isn't whether prison changes men. It does, always. The question is how and whether anyone, including the man himself, can understand what happened to him. Part 1, the moment the door closes. The first hours of incarceration are described, by nearly every man who's lived them in, almost identical terms. Time stops, not slow stops. There's a moment, usually alone in a cell for the first time. When the brain does something, it almost never does in normal life. It fully accepts an absence of choice. Dr. Craig Haney, a prison psychologist at UC Santa Cruz who has spent 4 decades studying incarcerated populations, calls this the psychological shock of total institutional control. You no longer decide when you eat, when you sleep, when you shower, when you speak, when the lights go on or off. Every micro-decision that makes up the fabric of a free human day gone. And the brain, which is built for agency, doesn't know what to do with that. For some men, the response is rage. For others, it's a strange dissociative calm, like the nervous system simply powers down. What both reactions share is this: the self, the psychological structure you spent your entire life building, begins to renegotiate its relationship with reality, and that renegotiation never fully stops, even after release. Before we go further, I want to be clear about something. This video isn't about whether people deserve to go to prison. That's a legal, moral, philosophical debate for another day. This video is about psychology, about what happens to a human mind when you put it inside a system that was not designed with the mind in mind. Because whatever you think about crime and punishment, what happens inside those walls will eventually walk back out, and we've barely begun to understand it. Part 2. Prisonization, the invisible curriculum. In 1940, sociologist Donald Clemmer coined a word that criminologists still use today: prisonization. It means the gradual absorption of the prison's norms, values, behaviors, and psychological patterns into a person's identity. In other words, the prison teaches you how to be a prisoner, and unlike most schools, this one has a 100% enrollment rate. Nobody opts out. Here's what the curriculum looks like. Lesson 1: never show weakness. In the general population of most prisons, emotional vulnerability is dangerous. Men learn fast to suppress fear, sadness, grief, confusion, not just to hide it from others. Over time, they learn to hide it from themselves. This is called emotional blunting. And it's not a choice, it's a survival adaptation. The problem is, survival adaptations don't come with an off switch. A man who spends 7 years learning to feel nothing will not, on the morning of his release, suddenly feel everything again. The neural pathways that process and express emotion have been deliberately, systematically suppressed, and rebuilding them, if it happens at all, takes years. Lesson 2: trust no one. The prison social environment is one of the most complex and dangerous human ecosystems ever studied. Alliances shift overnight. Information is currency. Vulnerability is an invitation. Men learn to read rooms, read faces, read silences with a hypervigilance that would be remarkable if it weren't also exhausting. Researchers call this adaptive paranoia, a rational response to a genuinely threatening environment. The problem, again, is the return. A man who has spent years scanning every person in a room for threat doesn't stop doing that because he's now standing in a grocery store. His nervous system doesn't know the difference. It just knows: stay alert, trust carefully, watch everything. Lesson 3: institutional dependence. This one is the quietest and perhaps the most devastating. The longer a man is incarcerated, the more his brain adapts to being told what to do. Not because he's weak, because the human brain is efficient. If every decision is made for you, the brain stops allocating resources to decision-making. Why maintain a skill you never use? After years inside, many men describe a terrifying phenomenon. They cannot make simple decisions on their own. Where to eat, what to buy, which direction to walk. The prison has outsourced their executive function. And when you hand the keys back, Some men look at those keys and feel not relief but panic. Part 3, the body remembers. What it tells. Narrator. We tend to think of prison as a psychological experience, but the body is in there too, and the body keeps score. Slower, more intimate tone. Chronic stress is the invisible tax of incarceration. Studies consistently show that incarcerated men have elevated cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone, for months and often years after release. What does chronic cortisol exposure do? It damages the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for memory and spatial navigation. It accelerates cellular aging. Incarcerated men biologically age faster than their free counterparts. It suppresses the immune system, the reproductive system, the digestive system. It keeps the body in a state of permanent low-level emergency. And then there's sleep. Inside, sleep is interrupted constantly. Counts happen at night. Violence is unpredictable. Noise is relentless. The brain learns to sleep lightly to never fully drop into deep, restorative rest. Men released from long sentences often report sleeping poorly for years afterward. Their bodies are still waiting for the cell door to slam open. There's a man named Marcus. He served 11 years in a state penitentiary in the American Midwest. He was released at 36. He described his first night in a free bed like this. I couldn't sleep on the mattress. Too soft. I ended up on the floor. Felt safer. It's been 4 years. I still sleep on the floor sometimes. The prison is gone, but the prison is still there. That's not metaphor. That's neuroscience. Part 4, identity. Who am I now? 6:330. Narrator. Erik Erikson, one of the 20th century's most influential developmental psychologists, argued that identity is not a fixed thing. It's an ongoing negotiation between the self and the environment. You are in part who your environment says you are. So what happens when your environment says for years that you are an inmate, a number, a risk assessment, a name on a file? What happens to a man who spends his most developmentally formative years, his 20s, his 30s, being told in 1,000 subtle and unsubtle ways that he is dangerous, controllable, and defined by the worst thing he ever did? He internalizes it, not because he's weak, because that's what humans do. We are the stories told about us until we find the strength to write our own. And that strength, that narrative agency, is precisely what incarceration is designed to remove. There's a concept in sociology called stigma management. When a man is released, he faces a choice, often unconscious, about how to handle the label of ex-con, or formerly incarcerated. Research by sociologist Irving Goffman shows that stigmatized individuals develop sophisticated strategies. Some conceal, hide their past, live in fear of discovery. Some deflect, minimize, joke about it, change the subject. Some own it, build an identity around survival, around having been through something most people cannot fathom. Each strategy has costs. Concealment breeds anxiety and shame. Deflection prevents authentic connection. Ownership invites judgment and the risk of being reduced to a single chapter of a long book. There is no clean option. There is only navigating. Part 5, The Return, When the World Moved On. 1630, narrator. Here's something nobody warns you about. When you come home, and home is not always the right word, the world has continued without you. Technology changed, prices changed, relationships changed, people changed. Children you left as toddlers are now teenagers who don't know how to look at you. Parents aged in ways that feel sudden and cruel. Friends either drifted or disappeared, and you stand in the middle of it all, carrying 5, 10, 15 years of compressed time, trying to slot yourself back into a world that kept moving while you were frozen. Psychologists call the cognitive challenges of re-entry reintegration shock. It shares features with what combat veterans experience returning from deployment. The world looks the same, but everything feels foreign. Because the person looking at it is not the same person who left. Employment, housing, identity documents. These are the logistical mountains every returning citizen must climb. In the United States alone, there are over 44,000 legal restrictions that apply specifically to people with felony convictions. limiting where they can live, what jobs they can hold, whether they can vote, whether they can access public housing or student loans. The prison sentence ends on paper. The punishment continues in practice. And the psychological burden of that, of being marked, limited, watched, compounds every other challenge of re-entry. Many men describe it as, "I did my time," but the time never did its part of the deal. Part 6. Can a man rebuild himself? 16:30 Narrator. Here is what the research actually shows, and I want to be precise because this matters. The changes prison makes to a man are not irreversible. They are not a life sentence of the mind, but rebuilding requires something that most post-release systems are spectacularly bad at providing: time, consistency, safety, and genuine human connection. Studies on post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people experience profound positive transformation after extreme adversity, show that incarcerated and formerly incarcerated men are not exempt from this possibility. In fact, some researchers argue that the depth of self-examination forced by incarceration, the confrontation with mortality, failure, identity, and time can produce wisdom and emotional depth unavailable through ordinary experience. This is not romanticization. It is not everything happens for a reason. It is simply the observation that the human capacity for growth is stubborn, remarkably, almost defiantly stubborn. The men who rebuild themselves most successfully tend to share several things: a narrative, a coherent story about what happened to them and what it means. That doesn't erase the past, but doesn't let it be the only chapter. A community, at least one or two people who see them fully, without the reduction of the label. A purpose, something to do, to build, to contribute to, work that carries meaning beyond survival. And patience with themselves, with the pace of change, with a world that is often slow to extend the grace they desperately need. None of these things are guaranteed. Many men return without any of them. And the recidivism rates, around 44% within a year in the US, tell that story plainly, not because returning citizens are broken, but because we release them into a system that was never designed to catch them. Prison changes men forever. That is not in question. The question is, what kind of change, and who bears responsibility for it? The man who made mistakes that led him there? Yes, in part. The system that puts more resources into surveillance than into mental health? Yes, in part. A society that finds it easier to lock away complexity than to sit with it? Yes, in very large part. Because here is what I keep coming back to. Every man who walks out of a prison gate walks back into our world, into our neighborhoods, our families, our cities. The psychological damage done inside does not stay inside. It ripples. So the question of what prison does to men is not really a question about prisoners. It's a question about us, about what we're willing to understand, what we're willing to fund, what we're willing to see. A man named James, who served 14 years, said something to me I haven't been able to shake. He said, "The hardest part wasn't getting out. The hardest part was realizing I still had to introduce myself to myself." That introduction, that long, painful, necessary conversation between a man and whoever he became, that's the real sentence, and it lasts a lifetime.